Hi, my name is Juan Pablo Garduño Jimenez, and today I will be doing a review on Hanya's and Yanagihara's book, A Little Life. It was first published back in 2015 by Doubleday, and it has a length of around 814 pages. So this is the book. I purchased it online on the iBook store. That's the cover. It has an interesting image on the cover because it shows what I would like to think it's the main character. That's Judson Francis suffering because this book is about a man that's never meant to recover from the things that happen to him. So in this book, it's it is told the story of Judson Francis, as I mentioned, and the people in his life. He's left partially disabled by a terrifying injury as a teenager. He's distraught about his past and usually hides himself and his past from others, even those closest to him, like his four friends, in which the story is like based. The relationship he forms with, as a young and as an older adult, sustains him longer than he expected ever to live. But in the end, Jude has faced too much abuse and heartache. He has been so damaged that to go on, and that's a terrible spoiler. Jude was left as an infant by his unknown parents in the care of a monastery where he grew up being taught and in some occasions or mainly physically and sexually abused by several men. He developed a trusting relationship with one of the monks, that's Brother Luke, and in some way he is like the first step of the relationship where he is shown as a suffering man. That's where his problem starts. And in some way, Hanya Yanagihara's planned this character of Jude to be like a person or someone who is constantly abused by other men since his childhood to his manhood, and it's never meant to get better. Like he goes through so many events in his life that his purpose of continuing living, like if I could say it in that way, it's no longer a reason for him to go on with his life. And well, in this book, they are treated like many things, and I liked some of them, and others I didn't personally. There's one that I would consider as the main theme. That's the value of friendship. There are four main characters that are introduced to the story in the first like 100 pages. JD, who becomes a downtown artist. Malcolm, who is a well-known architect. Willem, who goes from waiter to movie star practically overnight. And Jude, that's the main character, who is a lawyer, where he works himself up and becomes a partner in the DA's office in New York. So this is a story of four friends who like try to make it out in New York's Big Apple, and in some way it is I I would say like disappointing that there are so many events going through in that time of the story that there's no historical context. Like you can follow through the storyline of the main characters, and at some point it turns out that the story only follows Jude as the main character, but there's no like historical events. There's no 9/11. There's nothing happening in New York at that time, but the lives of the main characters. So there are a few things that I really do enjoy of this book. There's like the graphic shown of abuse and the effects it can have on someone's life. Although this book is an exaggeration of the events that can occur to someone, and you may like to up to a point that you may consider it like, is this a joke or is this something irrelevant? Because there's no chances of happening these many kind of events to a single person in his life. So So I will consider that Jude as an orphan that was abused from his childhood by monk by the monks of the monastery, and um, then he grows up to like live throughout many damaging relationships. He goes from one relationship where he is raped to another when he doesn't feel happy. He is damaged, as I said, on his teenage dreams by a person who bought him as a child prostitute. So he used to run his truck um, on his legs. So that's how he acquired one of his problems. Then he is like, I don't know, he's so damaged and he's so like lost in his suffering, and even in the story he tries to hide this kind of past from his friends, from JB, Malcolm, and William. But in some way he ends up talking to them. He ends up saying everything that he could, but that's not enough to keep him alive. um, and I would really consider that he can trust anyone and he doesn't feel worthy of love, even though as an adult he gets nothing but unconditional love from people who adore him, like JB, Malcolm, and Willem. So I think this is an exaggeration of how people can end up feeling after many years of abuse, many years of uh, like suffering. And that's one thing that I really do liked about the book, because you can really see the effects of a brutal past like Jude's reflected on the characters. In the book, Yanni, Yanagihara's experience waves the story of Jude's abuse passed into his present day narrative. In this character, he he's centered on living today's life, and he usually remembers something in his past. So that's a really interesting way of like um I would say like telling out the story. But there's like this sense of redundancy, or this sense that everything's going repeatedly, that there are too many details in the story that should be left out, because there are some things that are necessary for things to happen, but there are some things that are still missing from the story. So another thing that I well, not another thing, a thing that I would consider that is missing in the story is the years of friendship that united William, JB, Malcolm, and Jude, and on his like university years, on his college years, like the thing that really unites them as the group of friends they are. So I would consider this like a key point to to give it more sense of why their friendship lasts throughout the whole story. It is a well-written story, I think, because Hanya's ability to keep you interested throughout the whole book is really impressive. And as I said, there are some things that could be left out, but this is one like problem, the repetition. But there are other problems with this book that I would really like to address. They are like the characters are either too good or too bad for Jude's life in general. Like there's nothing like I would consider like in the middle of being good and being bad. They are the bad ones, like the monks, like the relationships. Even Willem is considered as a bad relationship up to some point, because he he really doesn't value the romantic relationship they are further in the book, but that's another case. So there are some ways I think in which this book may be improved, and there are some like interesting quotes that I would consider that are really true, and that I will appraise Hanya for trying to do that. There's one on chapter 3 that says, "He had looked at Jude. Then and had felt the same sensation he sometimes did when he really thought of June and what his life has been, a sadness. He might have called it, but it wasn't a pity sadness. It was a larger sadness, one that seemed to encompass all the poor striving people, the villains he didn't know, all living all living their lives, a sadness that's mingled with a wonder and awe at how hard humans everywhere try to live. Even when their days were so very difficult, even when their circumstances were so wretched. Life is so sad, he would think in those moments. It's so sad, and yet we all do it. We all cling to it. We all search for something to give us solace. So, this is a really interesting book quote. I consider it as my favorite throughout the whole book because it is like stated that sometimes we like try for damaged people to get better. We push them to the limits where we would think they would get better. Like we want them to get better, but sometimes we don't consider how sad their lives can be, how damaged they might be, and that's something this book really focuses on, like showing or showcasing the damage one can go through in his life and their willingness to continue living. And in this case, although the main character Jude ends up like opposite to this kind of message, uh, it is to an extent of how we are capable of like demanding people to get better and not knowing about the past. So there are many like interesting facts going on through this book. There's JB success and addiction to crystal meth. There's the relationship between Jude and Caleb, which ends up in rape. And there's also the whole past of Jude, the childhood prostitution, the monastery abuse. There's also, to one extent, William's like relationship with Caleb, how his body doesn't work due to his legs, how he's challenged every day to continue on with his life. And even though he's like a very quiet man who wants to keep everything to himself, it is like very traumatizing. I would consider it would be for me like very traumatizing not to tell anyone about my problems. So there's like a continuous show of damaging throughout this book, and there's also like the showcase of how people can feel as they Jude is constantly in pain. He's constantly cutting himself, and in some way he doesn't get the help he needed. And it goes to an extent where he rather like be set on fire than continue cutting himself. Those are graphic images on the book, and I would really consider that there are really some strong images and messages in this book, and that it should be appraised by critics. Um, there's also like this kind of dislike towards the book because it is like fictional. It is really non-related to real life events, but I would um, consider it as like the point of Hanya's of writing this book. She was considering as an exaggeration. It was never meant to be attached to any real life events. So I really consider this as a fictional, but at the same time, a revealing story. Up to some point, it is like relatable. I could relate um, merely to Jude. There are these characters that doesn't have any like background, but they are so forced into you to feel sorry, to feel the what Hanya wants you to feel. So I think the communication and the I would say like the transmission of the message and the emotions are there in the book, but there are still something to work on in order to get it to an extent where you can like really enjoy this book and you can say, oh, this is a really great book, and it is well structured, it is well written. But um, there are also like details that Hanya had throughout the whole story that really like I really liked. One is that the first part and the seventh are called the same. They're Lisbon and Street. Like it starts and tries to end with the same kind of purpose, the story. And even though, as I mentioned, there's so many suffering and there's so many critiques on whether this is a really graphic book. It is so story like there's so many diverse critics about this book and so many feelings you can get throughout the whole story that obviously Yanagihara like tapped into something serious and profound with this book, and I think people are responding to it. And well, like me, I bought it a year after it was um, published, and some way like to communicate that we all feel damaged, used, and unloved, and sometimes we don't even realize it, and not to the extent, well, it is not to the extent that Jude does, because it is an exaggeration. So most of us learn to overcome our insecurities and move on. But in the case of Jude, he's so terrified that he would like continue suffering, saying we're not good and we're not attractive, nor worthy of love. And in spite of being surrounded by people such as William, JB, Malcolm, there's this kind of like sense of that life is black and white, that you can like like in some ways pretend that it is all horrible, and sometimes that it is all beauty and it is all everything perfect. But some, well, as we get older, I would say that we learn to accept and to live with those fascinating events, and even though there are some damaging, we tend to overcome them. And it is like an a sentimental book. It is like something Hanya wanted us to feel. It is something she wants to communicate and to go through with her book. And that there's like hope for us, even though in this case there was no hope for you. And in some way, we need to be more like we need to be more concentrated on helping people to an extent where there is possible. We need to give them the help they need, because if Jude would have received the help he needed, like after the child prostitution, he wouldn't have gone through all the bad relationships in his life. So there wouldn't have been any plot story. If he would have had the help he needed, the story would have ended years before, well, the tragic ending. So I would consider that there are some ways in which Hanias could have like helped Jude, but as it was mentioned, he was never meant to get better. There were events that were like were meant to happen in order to demonstrate that Jude was constantly in pain and that he suffered throughout his whole life. So it was really interesting book. I found it really like moving, and that into consideration. This is a book worthy of prizes like the one it has. It is a book worthy of being a bestseller, because I think it is important for people to know what they're talking about and what they are and what other people maybe are living or going through. So, well, that's my opinion. Like, I really enjoyed this book. Jude was an interesting and fascinating character, and in spite of being damaged throughout his whole life, I found like really moving of his part to showcase like these emotions, this kind of feeling that there's always a constant fight for life, and that even though we might be surrounded by people who want to help us, they aren't always aware of what might be going through our lives if we don't let them be a part of them. So if we try to keep out some important details that those of the passive youth from our friends that may be like kind of helpful, and in spite of this being like demonstrated throughout gay relationships, throughout men and men stories, because there's no woman in the story. If you read the book, there's barely interaction with women, so this is a story of men with men. So that's another interesting fact. But I would consider it as a way of demonstrating that we have to continue fighting for everything that's important, and we might want to help those who aren't, to, well, to an extent where it is possible, because that's not always easy, and we always want the best for our loved ones, and we always want them to get better. So in the context of the book, there's always this kind of mixture of languages. There's also Italian mixture, there's scientific language. So I found that was really interesting of Hanya's part to include in the book. And I didn't really like much the part that there's no like as well, I would consider it like story or um, like a better plot line, because there's always focusing on damaging Jude's life. So there's always like this kind of thing to remember. And to some way, there are some happy lives. Well, in this book, it is showcased as happy 3 years, or the happy years, where they tend to live better, but it is ruined by continuous damaging events for Jude, and he ends up uh, like he did. So there's my review of the book. Like, I really enjoyed. I would recommend it to someone else. And in spite there are some bad critics or some like not favorable reviews on this book, like I would consider it to be like something that had to be written, that had to be talked. It is empowering for women to talk about relationships of men with men, and that our society is changing, and to some extent to showcase how there are several tragic events occurring in our lives, and that we have to overcome them, and to, well, try to live through them uh, without uh, getting to the point where Jude went. Um, we can deny that these are difficult subjects: relationships with men, suffering, child abuse, prostitution, rape. There's several emotional and physical abuse that we have to like to take into consideration when exposing these kind of things to the audience. Like, that's not an easy way to handle these massive amounts of things. So I really found out interesting this book because it handles them in a like a like a way in which you can relate and you can learn from these experiences, that even though they are fictional, they tell you something about what's happening in the world, and that we should like be more conscious of. So I really like this book. I purchased the deluxe edition because I wanted to read the whole story, and I would recommend you to read the chapters, even though it's a little bit like extent, and that it is a book worth reading, and that you might enjoy it, and that I really liked it. And I would consider you to read Youth's Life, A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. And that's all. I hope you like my review. I hope this wasn't too extent, or it wasn't too long for expressing my feelings or my opinions towards the book. So that's all, and I hope you can purchase this book and tell me about your opinions or feelings on the comment section. So go like this video, and I hope you enjoyed the 25 minutes of me talking about this amazing masterpiece. Thank you.